Three models vanished from a Vegas hotel in 1997. 26 years later, a lockbox solved the case. In the spring of 1997, three young women arrived in the city, their faces bright with excitement, their minds full of dreams. Each had come from a different part of the country, yet they shared a common goal: to take part in a high-profile photo shoot that promised to be a stepping stone in their modeling careers. Their names were Jessica, a confident young woman from California; Melissa, quiet but determined, who had grown up in Texas; and Anna from New York, a spirited soul with a laugh that could fill a room. Together, they represented hope, ambition, and the kind of youthful energy that often feels unstoppable. The hotel where they checked in was one of the city's iconic establishments, a place that promised luxury, discretion, and the allure of high society. Marble floors reflected the neon lights that spilled in from the strip, and chandeliers hung from ceilings high above, catching the sparkle of countless tiny bulbs. For the three women, it was more than a hotel. It was a playground of opportunity. They had a suite that overlooked the glittering streets below, and the moment they stepped in, they could feel the pulse of the city, like a heartbeat in their own chests. Their first evening was a blur of activity and excitement. They unpacked their belongings, trying on outfits they had carefully selected for the shoot. Jessica laughed as she twirled in a shimmering dress, while Anna snapped pictures of everything with her camera, eager to capture memories. Melissa sat quietly by the window, watching the lights of the city dance on the pavement below. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, a feeling that something important was about to begin. The next morning, the women arrived at the photo studio, greeted by a bustling team of photographers, stylists, and assistants. The session went smoothly, the models posing naturally, their energy infectious. They were professionals, yet they were still very young, and each frame seemed to capture more than just their faces. It captured their hopes, their excitement, and the beginning of what they imagined would be brilliant careers. After the shoot, they returned to the hotel, their minds buzzing with the day's work. The hotel itself was a character in the story, its halls both welcoming and mysterious. There were faces in the lobby that seemed familiar yet distant, voices in corridors that whispered and lingered. The models were polite to the staff, friendly to fellow guests, and careful to follow the rules, but there was an underlying tension in the hotel, something intangible that made the air feel slightly heavier than usual. That evening, the three women decided to explore the city. Las Vegas at night was different from the world they knew. The streets were alive with performers, street musicians, and tourists from all over the globe. Casinos glowed with endless lights, and the sound of slot machines created a rhythm that seemed to pulse through the city. The women laughed as they tried their luck at a few machines, savoring the thrill of small wins and the excitement of the unknown. They took pictures on the strip, posed near fountains, and allowed themselves to feel the joy of being young and free. Yet, despite the glitter and glamour, there were moments of unease. They noticed people who watched them a little too closely, a few strangers who lingered in doorways for no reason, and hotel staff who smiled politely but seemed to observe them a little longer than necessary. They dismissed these feelings, telling themselves it was just the excitement of being in a new city. Las Vegas had a way of making even the smallest discomfort seem insignificant against its bright, dazzling backdrop. The second day was much like the first, busy, exhausting, but filled with small victories. The photo shoot continued in a different location, this time in a studio that overlooked part of the city's skyline. The women were praised for their work, and the photographers remarked on their professionalism and charisma. In the evening, they attended a small gathering hosted by a local agency, meeting other models and industry professionals. The atmosphere was vibrant, filled with laughter and conversations about future opportunities. For the models, it felt like the world was opening its doors to them, and they stepped forward eagerly. By the third night, the sense of excitement had grown even stronger. They returned to the hotel after a long day, tired but exhilarated. They ordered room service and shared a quiet dinner in their suite, discussing the plans for the following day. Jessica talked about an upcoming audition, Anna mentioned a possible collaboration, and Melissa shared a few ideas for a personal portfolio. They felt safe in their room, convinced that they were just three young women chasing their dreams, nothing more, nothing less. But then something changed. That night when they were supposed to rest, The world outside their hotel room seemed different. Shadows moved strangely in the corners of the suite, and the usual background noise of the city seemed quieter, almost as if it were holding its breath. The models didn't notice it at first. They were too absorbed in their conversation, too focused on the excitement of their trip. But the feeling lingered, subtle and unexplainable, like a distant warning they could not understand. The following morning, the hotel staff found the suite empty. The models' belongings were still there, carefully arranged as if they had simply stepped out for a walk. Their luggage remained unpacked, and their personal items, wallets, purses, and phones, were untouched. No one had seen them leave, and no guest reported encountering them in the corridors. Panic set in quickly among the staff, who immediately notified the police. What had seemed like a simple case of three young women enjoying their trip had turned into a mystery that no one could explain. Police arrived within hours, questioning the staff, other guests, and anyone who might have seen the women. They checked the security cameras, though in 1997 the coverage was limited and grainy. The footage showed the models entering the hotel the night before, but nothing more. There was no sign of struggle, no evidence of foul play, and no immediate leads. Friends and families of the women were called, their voices trembling with worry and disbelief. How could three young women vanish without a trace in one of the busiest hotels in Las Vegas? As days turned into weeks, the case remained unsolved. Tips from the public came in, some promising, others clearly mistaken. Authorities followed every lead, yet each one ended in a dead end. The media covered the story extensively, their headlines filled with speculation and questions, but no answers emerged. The families of Jessica, Melissa, and Anna were left in a state of constant anxiety, their lives forever changed by the sudden disappearance. The story of the three missing models became part of Las Vegas lore. Guests whispered about it in the halls, journalists revisited the case from time to time, and the hotel itself carried a subtle air of mystery, as if it remembered the young women who had once stayed there and had never returned. People spoke of how the city's glitter sometimes hid shadows, how the excitement of opportunity could sometimes mask danger, and how even in a place full of life, people could disappear without a trace. Years later, the mystery would still capture the imagination of those who remembered the case. But at that moment in 1997, there was only confusion, fear, and a deep sense of loss. The three models, full of ambition and hope, had vanished, leaving behind a story that no one could explain and a question that lingered in the minds of everyone who knew them. What had happened to Jessica, Melissa, and Anna in the heart of Las Vegas? The disappearance of Jessica. Melissa and Anna shook the city of Las Vegas. For a place that thrived on excitement and entertainment, the sudden vanishing of three young women was a stark reminder that even in a city of lights, darkness could creep quietly. Police worked tirelessly, but in 1997, the tools and technology available were limited. Investigators walked the hotel corridors again and again, interviewing staff who remembered small details, who brought breakfast trays, who had seen the women last, but nothing added up to a clear answer. Every lead seemed to vanish as quickly as it appeared, leaving only frustration in its wake. The families were desperate for information. Jessica's parents flew in from California, their eyes red from crying, but their voices full of determination. Melissa's family, who had never traveled far from their small Texas town, felt overwhelmed by the size and chaos of the city. Anna's parents arrived from New York, bewildered by the sprawling hotels and flashing neon lights that surrounded them. Each family tried to piece together the timeline, retracing every moment their daughters had shared in letters, phone calls, and brief messages. They clung to hope, yet with every passing hour, hope became harder to hold. The media descended on the case quickly, fascinated by the glamour, the mystery, and the tragedy. Headlines screamed of vanishing models and the missing trio, drawing attention from across the country. Reporters interviewed family members and friends, sometimes sensitively, sometimes not. Rumors began to circulate. Some claimed the women had run away, others whispered of foul play. None of these theories were confirmed, and for the families, the speculation was painful, adding to their uncertainty. Within the police department, detectives worked in shifts, reviewing evidence and following up on calls from the public. There were reports of strangers seen near the hotel, vehicles spotted at odd hours, and brief sightings of women who resembled the missing models. Each tip was followed carefully. Officers drove across the city, checked parking lots, questioned taxi drivers, and spoke to casino employees. Yet, every trail led to dead ends. It was as if the women had vanished into thin air, leaving only questions behind. One of the more frustrating aspects of the investigation was the hotel itself. Though the staff was cooperative, the building was massive, with thousands of rooms, hallways that twisted like a maze, and numerous hidden corners. Security cameras were few and grainy, showing shadows more clearly than people. The hotel was busy every day, filled with tourists, performers, and employees, making it nearly impossible to pinpoint exact movements. Investigators sometimes felt as though they were searching for tiny lights in a city that never went dark. Meanwhile, life continued around the case. Guests came and went, casinos hummed with energy, and performers carried on as if nothing had changed. The disappearance became a story in the background of the city, a quiet shadow beneath the glittering lights. But for the families, it remained all-consuming. Each day without answers was a day filled with fear, sorrow, and frustration. Friends of the models held vigils and set up missing persons campaigns, hoping that someone, somewhere, might remember something that could help. As weeks passed, police expanded their investigation beyond the hotel. They spoke to photographers, modeling agencies, and industry professionals who had contact with the women. They reviewed travel records, hotel bookings, and even flight manifests. Patterns were analyzed, but no conclusive evidence emerged. Investigators wondered if the women had been lured away, if an accident had occurred, or if there was some other explanation that remained hidden. Every theory was considered, but every theory led to more questions than answers. Detectives also examined the personal lives of the women, looking for connections that might explain their disappearance. Jessica had been focused on her career, meticulous in her planning and cautious in her actions. Melissa had close friends and a supportive family, with no known conflicts or unusual behavior. Anna had a lively social life and a bright personality, but nothing in her background suggested danger. The investigation revealed normal, healthy young women who were simply chasing their dreams. The normalcy of their lives made the case all the more puzzling and heartbreaking. The city itself seemed to react to the mystery. Employees in the hotel spoke quietly about the missing women, sharing memories of smiles, conversations, and moments that now seemed hauntingly distant. Some guests claimed to feel a chill in the hallways, a subtle reminder that something had happened that no one could explain. Even years later, staff would recall the case as one of the most mysterious incidents they had ever experienced, a story whispered quietly among themselves. Despite the challenges, detectives refused to give up. They knew that in cold cases, sometimes the smallest detail could break the mystery wide open. Officers revisited the hotel, spoke to new staff members, and searched forgotten corners of the building. Old files were reviewed repeatedly, and patterns were analyzed with patience and precision. Every witness statement, no matter how minor it seemed, was re-examined. Slowly, a picture of the women's last known hours began to form, though it remained incomplete and frustratingly vague. The emotional toll on the families was enormous. Each day, they lived with uncertainty, alternating between hope and despair. They clung to the belief that their daughters were alive somewhere, though there were no signs to confirm it. They worked with private investigators, spread flyers, and reached out to anyone who might provide a clue. Nights were the hardest, when silence in the homes contrasted sharply with the bustling energy of Las Vegas where their daughters had vanished. Friends and relatives offered support, but nothing could replace the presence of Jessica, Melissa, and Anna. Months turned into years, and the case became a cold case in the official records, though it never left the hearts of those involved. Police periodically reviewed it, hoping for new technology or a fresh perspective to provide answers. Occasionally, tips arrived from people who thought they recognized someone in a photograph or remembered seeing something unusual, but none led to a breakthrough. The story became a symbol of uncertainty, a mystery that could not be solved despite the best efforts of many. Throughout the years, the missing models story continued to capture public attention. True crime enthusiasts, journalists, and authors would revisit the case in magazines and documentaries. People were fascinated by the glamour, the mystery, and the unanswered questions. The city itself seemed to hold the memory quietly, a reminder that behind the bright lights and excitement, the lives of ordinary people could be touched by tragedy in an instant. Meanwhile, life moved forward for the families. They continued to advocate for their daughters, organizing events to raise awareness about missing persons. They worked with charities, spoke to schools, and connected with other families who had experienced similar pain. The emotional journey was ongoing, filled with grief, hope, and determination. Each anniversary of the disappearance brought reflections, memories, and sometimes tears, but also a quiet resolve to never forget the women who had vanished so long ago. Detectives occasionally revisited the hotel during routine inspections, walking the same hallways where the models had last been seen. They noted changes in the building, renovations, and the passing of staff members who had witnessed those critical days. The passage of time had not erased the questions, and the memory of the three women lingered as a quiet, unresolved thread. Even with modern technology improving investigative methods, the details of what had happened remained elusive, like a story partially told, waiting for someone to uncover the final chapter. In the end, part 2 of the story highlights the uncertainty, the frustration, and the ongoing search for answers. The police, families, and community all shared the burden of not knowing. Las Vegas, with all its lights and excitement, held its secrets tightly, and the disappearance of Jessica, Melissa, and Anna remained one of its most puzzling mysteries. The stage was set for the day, many years later, when a surprising discovery would finally bring clarity. But until then, the question of what had happened continued to haunt everyone who remembered the young women. 26 years had passed since Jessica, Melissa, and Anna vanished from their Las Vegas hotel. The city had changed in countless ways. Old casinos had closed and new ones had risen, the neon lights were brighter, and the streets were busier than ever. Yet, for the families, the passage of time had done little to erase the memory of those three young women. Every year they quietly hoped for a breakthrough, even as the world seemed to move on. For them, every day was still marked by the question, what had happened to their daughters? The hotel where the women had disappeared was no longer exactly as it had been in 1997. Renovations had modernized the lobby, hallways had been repainted, and rooms were updated with contemporary decor. Yet, some parts of the building were untouched, hidden corners and storage areas that had been forgotten over the years. It was during one such renovation that workers made an unexpected discovery. In a small, unused storage closet on a quiet floor, a hidden lockbox was found behind a false wall panel. The box was dusty, old, and heavy, but it had a small, sturdy lock that had kept its contents hidden for decades. At first, the workers assumed it was simply forgotten hotel property, old belongings left behind by a previous guest or a staff member. But curiosity prompted them to call the authorities before opening it. When the police arrived, the scene became tense with anticipation. Detectives who had worked on the cold case years ago were contacted, and soon the area was filled with people who remembered the disappearance with both sorrow and hope. Slowly, carefully, the lock was opened, revealing items that immediately drew the attention of everyone present. Inside the box were personal belongings of Jessica, Melissa, and Anna. There were passports, letters, photographs, and small personal effects such as jewelry and notebooks. The objects were intact but clearly old, preserved in a way that suggested someone had deliberately hidden them. There were no obvious signs of tampering, and nothing in the box seemed to explain how the women had disappeared, but it was enough to reignite hope that answers might finally be within reach. Police carefully cataloged every item. DNA samples were taken from the objects, fingerprints were lifted from surfaces, and photographs were scanned for clues. Modern forensic technology, far more advanced than what had been available in 1997, was now being used to analyze every detail. Detectives examined the letters and notebooks, hoping to find personal insights or clues that might have been overlooked decades ago. Every photograph was scrutinized for faces in the background, for locations, and for people who might have been nearby at the time. Among the items was a small photograph taken during the women's stay in Las Vegas. It showed the three models smiling, standing near a hotel entrance with a shadowed figure in the background. At first, it seemed insignificant, but experts in photo analysis noted that the figure appeared to be following them, watching closely. While it was not proof of anything, it became a potential lead. Investigators began to cross-reference hotel records, staff logs, and guest registries from the time, hoping to identify the mysterious figure. The letters and notebooks offered another layer of insight. In Jessica's notebook, there were personal reflections about her excitement and fears during the trip. Melissa's journal included careful observations of her surroundings, including people she felt were unusual or out of place. Anna's notes captured small details, such as hotel employees who smiled too often or seemed to linger near the elevators. These writings painted a picture of young women who were aware of their environment, intelligent and cautious, but who had been confronted with circumstances beyond their control. As the investigation moved forward, detectives focused on the idea that someone within the hotel or someone familiar with the building may have played a role. They cross-checked staff records from 1997, paying attention to employees who were no longer employed, who had suspicious histories, or who were associated with unusual incidents. They interviewed surviving staff members who had been working at the hotel during the disappearance. Some remembered the women as cheerful and professional, but a few admitted to noticing things they hadn't thought much of at the time: strangers in the hallways, unusual deliveries, and moments that now seemed significant in hindsight. The renewed investigation also involved technology that had not existed in 1997. Security camera footage that had once been grainy was enhanced, revealing faces and details that had previously gone unnoticed. Experts in digital reconstruction pieced together movements and timelines, creating a clearer picture of the women's final hours in the hotel. It became evident that someone had been carefully watching them, and that the disappearance was not random but likely planned. Families were involved at every step, their emotions a mix of relief, sorrow, and hope. Seeing the items from the lockbox brought back memories, some joyful, some painful. They spent hours with detectives, identifying personal belongings, recalling stories, and sharing insights about their daughters' personalities. Every photograph and letter became a piece of a larger puzzle, slowly revealing patterns and connections that had eluded investigators for decades. As days turned into weeks, police began to narrow down suspects. Patterns emerged from the evidence in the lockbox, witness recollections, and forensic analysis. The investigation suggested that the women had encountered someone who knew their schedule and movements, someone who had access to the hotel or had observed them closely. Detectives explored every angle, considering not just strangers, but also people who had interacted with the women during their stay. The theory that the disappearance had been orchestrated carefully became more likely. The emotional weight of the case was heavy on everyone involved. For the families, it was almost surreal to feel a sense of progress after so many years. They could finally envision answers that had once seemed impossible. Police, too, felt a renewed sense of purpose. The cold case that had sat on the shelf for decades now had momentum, driven by both evidence and technology. It was a reminder that even the most mysterious cases could be reopened and solved with patience, persistence, and careful observation. The public followed the renewed investigation closely. News outlets covered the discovery of the lockbox, sharing photographs of the items and the story of the missing models. People were captivated by the decades-long mystery, the resilience of the families, and the promise that the truth might finally come to light. The story inspired discussions about cold cases, the importance of modern forensic methods, and the persistence of justice even when time has passed. Every new lead brought investigators closer to understanding what had happened. Forensic experts identified materials and items that suggested the involvement of someone with knowledge of the hotel's structure and security systems. Handwriting on letters and notes was analyzed to verify authenticity and to look for connections to known suspects. Even small details like fingerprints on the lockbox itself were examined meticulously. Each discovery, while small, added a piece to the puzzle that had remained unsolved for decades. The investigation also revealed the profound impact of time. Memories faded, records were incomplete, and witnesses had changed. Yet the persistence of both the families and the police highlighted how dedication could bridge the gap of decades. It was a testament to the idea that truth could survive time, even when it was hidden behind years of uncertainty and silence. Slowly, the case began to approach a breakthrough. A combination of evidence from the lockbox, Enhanced photographs, witness statements, and forensic analysis allowed detectives to create a timeline of the women's final day in the hotel. They could see who had interacted with them, who had been nearby, and who had opportunities that aligned with their disappearance. While the full story was not yet complete, the investigation had moved from a state of frustration to one of clarity. For the families, the discovery of the lockbox brought both relief and a sense of sorrow. Relief, because it meant that the mystery was no longer unsolvable. Sorrow, because the details of what had occurred were likely painful and complex. Yet there was hope that the items could lead to justice, closure, and answers that had been missing for more than a quarter of a century. The lockbox was more than a container of old belongings. It was a key, a bridge between the past and the present, and a symbol that truth could finally emerge, no matter how long it had been hidden. In the end, Part 3 shows the turning point of the story. After 26 years, a simple hidden lockbox brought new life to a cold case, uncovering clues that had been invisible for decades. The investigation, now aided by modern technology and fresh perspectives, had begun to piece together the mystery of Jessica, Melissa, and Anna's disappearance. What had once seemed impossible was now possible, and the hope of resolution and justice had returned, shining as brightly as the lights of Las Vegas that had once seemed indifferent to the tragedy within its walls. After 26 long years, the investigation into the disappearance of Jessica, Melissa, and Anna had finally entered a stage that promised answers. The discovery of the lockbox had reopened the case, giving detectives new clues, insights, and evidence to follow. Modern technology had transformed the way the police approached old cases. DNA analysis, fingerprint identification, and digital reconstruction of security footage all combined to provide a clearer picture of the women's last hours. For the families, every new piece of information brought a mixture of hope and anxiety, as they understood that the truth could finally emerge, but it might also reveal painful realities. The forensic team worked meticulously with every item from the lockbox. Letters were analyzed for handwriting, photographs enhanced for details, and personal belongings examined for trace evidence. Tiny fibers from clothing and hair were checked against known databases, fingerprints were matched with old records, and even the composition of objects was scrutinized for clues. Each day, detectives discovered more pieces that had previously been overlooked, painting a vivid story of the women's final days in the hotel. It became clear that the disappearance had not been random. Someone had followed the models, observed their routines, and had taken advantage of their trust and familiarity with the hotel environment. Detectives focused on potential suspects who had access to the hotel and who had been present at the time. Hotel staff, visitors, and contractors were all considered. A breakthrough came when a former employee recalled seeing a man frequently near the elevators and corridors that the women used, someone who asked unusually detailed questions about guests and their schedules. At first, the memory seemed faint and unreliable after so many years, but combined with forensic evidence from the lockbox and photographs, it became a significant lead. The photograph that had been enhanced revealed the man clearly following the women, lingering behind them as they moved through the hotel. It was enough to reopen lines of inquiry that had gone cold decades earlier. Detectives traced his identity, reviewing records, interviews, and alibis. They discovered that he had been involved in minor incidents around the hotel, but had never been convicted of serious crimes. With modern forensic and investigative techniques, it was possible to link him indirectly to the disappearance, based on his movements, access, and presence near the women during critical moments. At the same time, the families of Jessica, Melissa, and Anna were brought into the process more actively than ever before. They reviewed photographs, letters, and items with detectives, providing insight into small details only loved ones could recognize. A necklace, a particular arrangement of papers, and personal items helped investigators confirm the ownership of the belongings, further solidifying the connection between the items in the lockbox and the missing women. These confirmations, while simple, were powerful, proof that the objects had been deliberately preserved and hidden, not randomly misplaced. The emotional weight of the investigation was intense. For the families, every discovery was both a relief and a source of sorrow. Relief because it meant that the truth was finally within reach. Sorrow, because the full details might reveal dangers, betrayals, and actions that had caused irreparable harm. They spent long hours with detectives, recounting memories, sharing photographs, and explaining personal traits that could help in understanding the case. The cooperation between law enforcement and families created a renewed sense of determination and optimism that had been absent for decades. As the investigation progressed, evidence suggested that the women had been lured into a situation they could not escape. Items in the lockbox, such as carefully folded letters, journals, and small personal effects, hinted at interactions that the women had initially thought were harmless, but which ultimately played a role in their disappearance. Detectives carefully reconstructed the timeline, using every available clue. They reviewed hotel records, photographs, and recollections from staff, connecting moments that had previously seemed isolated into a continuous chain of events. The public watched with fascination as news of the case resurfaced. Media outlets covered the discovery of the lockbox and the renewed investigation, highlighting the determination of both police and families. People were drawn to the story not only because of the glamour of Las Vegas, but also because it demonstrated the persistence of truth and justice over time. Discussions about cold cases, forensic technology, and investigative persistence filled news articles, blogs, and social media, sparking interest nationwide. Weeks of analysis, interviews, and verification eventually led to a breakthrough. The combination of evidence from the lockbox, forensic analysis, and witness recollection pointed to a suspect who had been overlooked in 1997. This individual had left subtle traces that had gone unnoticed in the chaos of the initial investigation, but were now visible through the lens of modern technology. Detectives compiled a full dossier, including photographs, interviews, timeline reconstructions, and forensic results, creating a clear picture of the suspect's potential involvement. The families received the news cautiously. They were told that the investigation had reached a stage where authorities could confidently identify a person connected to the disappearance. There was no celebration, only a quiet acknowledgement that answers were finally emerging. Emotions were complex. There was relief that the case was progressing, sadness that the full story might be painful, and hope that justice would finally be served. They prepared themselves for the final steps in the long journey of truth. Authorities then obtained additional evidence tying the suspect to the women's movements and the lockbox's location. Interviews with former hotel employees confirmed unusual behavior patterns, deliveries, and presence in restricted areas. Small details such as timing, keycard records, and witness recollections all aligned to create a coherent picture of events. Detectives were careful to verify every piece of information, knowing that the case had been unsolved for decades and that accuracy was essential. Finally, law enforcement reconstructed the events leading to the women's disappearance in a way that was consistent with all available evidence. The models had been approached by someone who seemed friendly and helpful, someone who gained their trust over a period of time. Items from the lockbox suggested that personal interactions had been carefully observed, and small details in letters and journals confirmed the women had noticed subtle irregularities, but did not perceive danger until it was too late. The story, pieced together through modern technology and persistent investigation, revealed the meticulous nature of the plan that had kept the women's fate a mystery for so many years. For the families, this reconstruction provided both clarity and closure. It answered the questions that had haunted them for decades: what had happened, how it had occurred, and who had been involved. While the details were sometimes difficult to accept, the truth was finally out. After 26 years of uncertainty, the women's lives and experiences were no longer shrouded in mystery. For the first time, families could grieve properly, remembering Jessica, Melissa, and Anna not only for the tragedy of their disappearance, but also for their courage, ambition, and the joy they had brought into the world. The case also became a powerful example of the importance of persistence and the role of technology in solving cold cases. Law enforcement agencies highlighted the investigation as a demonstration of how decades-old mysteries could be solved with patience, collaboration, and new tools. The story inspired other families, investigators, and communities to continue searching for truth, showing that no case was truly closed until all possibilities were exhausted. Ultimately, justice and closure were served in a way that honored the lives of the three women. Families could finally say that their daughters' stories had been understood, their experiences documented, and their memories preserved. The lockbox, once a hidden container of mystery, had become a symbol of hope, resilience, and the enduring power of truth. It reminded everyone involved that even when time passes and evidence seems lost, persistence and care could bring clarity to even the most confounding mysteries. The emotional journey was profound. Families held a small, private gathering to remember the women, placing some of the items from the lockbox on display as a tribute. They spoke of their daughters, dreams, personalities, and the bright futures that had been interrupted. Friends and loved ones joined them, sharing stories and memories, laughing at joyful moments, and crying for the time that was lost. The gathering became both a moment of mourning and a celebration of life, a recognition that while tragedy had struck, the truth had finally emerged, and the women's stories would live on. Las Vegas, ever vibrant and alive, continued to glow with its neon lights and buzzing streets. But for those who knew the story, the city now carried a quieter meaning. It was a place where a mystery had once unsettled hearts, where uncertainty had loomed for decades, and where, at last, the determination of families, police, and modern technology had revealed the truth. The disappearance of Jessica, Melissa, and Anna, while tragic, was no longer a story without an ending. The final chapter, though bittersweet, offered justice, understanding, and closure that had been long overdue. In the end, Part 4 completes the story of disappearance, investigation, and resolution. The women's lives, ambitions, and memories were finally honored. Families found peace, the case served as a lesson in persistence and hope, and the mystery that had haunted Las Vegas for 26 years was finally solved. The story became a testament to the enduring human spirit, the refusal to give up, the search for truth, and the power of love, memory, and justice to prevail even against the longest odds.